Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agmendan. Today, we're going to talk about American interventionism in South America, and the first country we're going to talk about is Venezuela. So, you want to take it away, Suvidh?
Yeah, sure. So Venezuela obviously has been in the news recently, and I mean for more reasons than one. It's a very important country because number one, of course, it's got the biggest oil reserve on planet Earth. So in terms of U.S. interventionism, that obviously gives us an interest in Venezuela, regardless. But let's go all the way back to Hugo Chavez, who was the president of Venezuela during the 2002 coup.
Mm-hmm.
He had, which was backed by the U.S., of course.
Mm-hmm.
He openly promoted the revolution in Cuba and the revolution or the political situation in Iran and Libya, which both were opponents of the U.S. at the
Mm-hmm.
time. um, Not only that, he was also working on consolidating government power into the national oil company. I forget what it's called. And he was also redirecting those profits from the oil into social programs, and he wasn't letting any American oil companies in. So this obviously gave us an incentive to intervene.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to talk about this topic too, because obviously the time and date when it happened and the oil itself. So, uh, we discovered Venezuelan oil in like the 1930s, and we started developing it in the 1940s and 1950s. So, the United States, when we first found the oil, we basically went to Venezuela and gave them a terrible deal where the United States oil companies got the vast majority of the profits, kind of like the it was a better deal than what the British gave the Iranians, where the British kept like 90% of the profit. But it was pretty bad deal. But the biggest part of like Venezuelan oil is that it's really bad. Even though they have the biggest proven oil reserve in the world, I think most people don't understand that Venezuelan oil is very thick. So it's not very good. You can't just like put it in your engine. It needs a lot of refinement. So what they did is they built a ton of refineries on the coast of Texas because, I mean, if you go across the Caribbean and Gulf, it's the closest location. And so, really, even though that the United States owned most of these like oil like producing areas, it wasn't like we were making tons of money off of it. But we were. I mean, this is important to say. We didn't really know that we had a lot of oil in the United States at that time, so it was still very important. But later on, when the United States like would find shell, like or is it shale oil under the ground and figure out how to get it, we really stopped caring about Venezuela for a while. Besides politically, since they were socialist.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, of course, don't even get me started on those refineries. I've been to Houston. I mean, there's they call it the carcinogenic coast, you know?
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, that's very true. But still, oil is one of the most important assets that Venezuela has. It's
Easily.
90% of their exports, or
Hmm.
at least it was at some point. They don't export anything else. It's just oil. And they have like a mentality where it's like we can buy everything we need. That's like their motto.
Hmm.
They don't make cars, they don't make anything. They just export oil. That's how they get all their money. But
And
the
it's
problem is you sell oil. Obviously, oil is traded in dollars, the American dollar. Petrodollars roll into the country. What happens is, by the way, the Venezuelan currency is a bolivar.
hmm
You have to turn those dollars into bolivars, and so that like super appreciates the exchange rate,
hmm
um, and it basically leads to sector collapse. Like all the other sectors, like economic sectors, I mean agriculture, whatever, they just collapse completely. And
and the
now you're completely dependent on oil.
yeah, and
And then and
The
then
Ven-
yeah,
they don't
sorry, go ahead.
even manage it well. Like
Hmm.
like so state-run
Hmm.
organizations, we don't really have them in the United States, obviously, but like places in China or Russia, there is state-run companies. So it's just a company that's run by the state, and they have less competition because the state can always bail them out. But what they did in Venezuela was they just consolidated in one mega corporation. It's kind of like how Sony is in Korea, but if Sony was owned by the no, Samsung was owned by the by the state.
Hmm.
So and then it's managed so poorly, and when there is any money that's given, the country doesn't develop itself. Like in Norway, where they have almost like a retirement for the country when they run out of oil, or they don't invest in any infrastructure to facilitate other industries. Like Suvidh said, it used to be 90%. Now recently it's been 60% because they realized they needed to diversify. But 60% of your exports being oil is still tremendous. You know,
Hmm.
so when
Mhm.
we did the blockade on Venezuela, we basically destroyed their economy.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know?
and you know,
Especially
sorry,
right.
I
Well,
just
one
wanted
thing
to
I
go
want to say is
back.
like especially
Mhm.
with how
Okay.
sorry. Just like especially with like how volatile oil like prices can be, right? Having a country so dependent on oil is just it's just not a very stable form
Well,
of.
you see, the problem is also, and I don't know if I made this clear enough, but petrodollars roll in, right? The exchange rate appreciates. That
Hmm.
means it is literally economically like it's not feasible for for you to sell anything else. Like
Hmm.
it's just not feasible. It's not worth it, because you get so much money from oil, and the exchange rate is so insane. Like there's just no point in rolling those bolivars into the country because you're getting petrodollars. It
Yeah.
just doesn't make sense economically. So and also this leads to an environment that's perfect for authoritarianism because
Hmm.
their entire economy is built on oil. The leaders don't care about taxes. They don't even care about their citizens because they don't need them. They just have oil. So
Yeah.
this obviously leads to people like Maduro, Hugo Chavez. They were all dictators, which is,
Which was a
this
perfect way for the
makes sense.
United States to come in. Because the United
Hmm.
States, obviously, their biggest worry right now in South America is Chinese influence. Already, you're starting to see the Chinese break into the Brazilian market, and especially before Javier Milei, they're breaking into the Argentine. And the Venezuelans, fearing the United States, have been getting chummy with the Russians and the Chinese. So, because Maduro is so dictatorial, it was really easy for the United States to really commit like break international law to get him out of there. And obviously, it was seen as a big celebration in many parts of the world. Many Venezuelans inside and outside of Venezuela liked it. And it allowed the United States to reassert its influence in Venezuela without really having to do anything. So, uh, it was kind of this is obviously the most recent example of U.S. interventionism, but we decided to start with this one first because this is only going to be the start of a new doctrine for the West. But we're going
Mm.
to transition now to Colombia, and oh, I guess I'll start this one. I forgot. So with Colombia, the most important thing to talk about is actually Panama. So Panama is in Central America now. It's a Central American country, but most people don't realize that it was actually a part of Colombia. So Colombia used to be a Spanish colony, and it was run as New Granada with a bunch of other countries. And when Bolivar basically started the independence movement, he tried to create something called Grand Colombia. So it had Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Panama. But it collapsed pretty soon after, and but Colombia and Panama stayed one country, and they always kind of viewed it that way. But later on, I think late 1800s, French a French company came in, and they're like, hey, they signed a deal with the Colombian government to try to build a canal across the Panama to try to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But it went really terribly and everyone died. So they left. But a U.S. company actually took it over. And the Colombians were fearing U.S. influence. So they were like, we don't really want you to do that. So the United States, I don't exactly know what year it is. It was definitely either like 1890s or
1903.
1803. Okay. So
1903.
1903.
1903.
Yeah. What we did was we supported local Panamanian rebels and made the country independent and threatened Colombia if they didn't let them. So that's how we gained the canal zone, and the canal is part of Panama right now, and it has been for many people's lives, especially like my life. It's always been part of Panama, but literally for like 50, 60 years, the United States directly controlled it. And, we're going to kind of transition into the other U.S. companies in the area. So, Sabine?
Yeah.
Right.
The United Fruit Company, which Nityant's going to talk about.
Yeah. Like so in Colombia, there's a lot of banana plantations by the United Fruit Company, and which is an American company, and there was there was a strike by the United Fruit Workers where they demanded, better like I don't know, better wages, better working hours, better conditions. And once these workers went on strike, the U.S. threatened Colombia that if they didn't deal with it, that the U.S. would come and deal with it. And so the Colombian government just they decided to deal with it and by
They
by just
executed them
brutally
all.
brutally like killing
Yeah.
hundreds of workers. I mean,
Well, some
it's
sources
it's
say it was like less than 50.
it's
Some
yeah,
sources say it was
it's
more than a
disputed.
thousand. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Either or, they killed a bunch of people because the United States
Yeah,
threatened
yeah.
it.
they
Yeah.
definitely did kill people in order to put down the like insurrection, showing how strong US companies interests are in the area.
Mhm. Speaking of U.S. companies' interests, we can also talk about the communism in the, or I guess I should say Marxism-Leninism in the area in the form of the FARC. Uh, I think Nate, you know
Here,
some
I can
about that.
actually give a little bit of history on like how the FARC
Yeah,
like came into being. So there was a ruler in Colombia that was very popular, and his name was I always forget, but his name it's Jorge. Uh, I forget what his last
Just
name
go
is.
with Jorge.
Jorge something. I don't know. Yeah, his name's Jorge. And he was very popular, although he was socialist or socialist leaning.
Hmm.
And then he was conveniently killed right before elections. It's like still disputed onto why he was killed or like what the actual like motives were, but he died and he would have became like he had widespread popular support, but after his death it led to a huge civil war that killed around 300,000 people in Colombia, leading and then at the end of the civil war, what ended up happening was a lot of the socialist leaning or like people, they created enclaves in the south. Not They weren't trying to create a new country, especially whenever they started.
Hmm.
Whenever they first started, it was just an enclave, as you might have a Chinatown. This was like their kind of like version of that, I guess. Okay,
Hmm.
but it was a political like enclave. They were just trying to like develop like agriculture or stuff like that. But in response to that, the CIA, they started Operation or like some plan,
plan. Yeah,
yeah, plan like
Jose.
Lazo,
Yeah, Lazo, something like
yeah,
that.
plan Lazo, which just funded Colombian efforts to just like basically just to destroy these enclaves, which came to be known as FARC.
Yeah, and that also relates to a more modern version of that, which is Plan Colombia under President Clinton. It was marketed as a counter-narcotics campaign, but it was also a counterinsurgency in which the U.S. actually gave a lot of military aid to Colombia. I believe Colombia became the country that had the third most U.S. military aid at the time because of this, and basically they were trying to get cocaine out and the insurgents out. And the UN reports that it didn't affect cocaine production at all, while US reports say that cocaine production dropped by 72%. So that's a little bit disputed, but it was still mainly a counterinsurgency.
Yeah, and it's like, but ever since really Colombia, well, even then has been a like stalwart ally of the United States, and that has only really been recently in question, uh, like by the administration, last year. So last year, the United States started its operations against Venezuela to pressure the Maduro government, and I remember, I think it's Gustavo Petro is the Colombian president right now, and he was the first elected socialist in Colombian history to become president. And um, he really denounced what the Trump administration was doing within uh, Venezuela. And it started a really big personal beef between him and Donald Trump. And even today, after the Maduro operation and capture, we're seeing the Trump administration constantly kind of threaten Gustavo as well as Cuba, where he's like, "Oh, we'll do the same thing to you." Well, they probably won't have to because there's an election coming up in 2026. But I just wanted to point that out, just because this is a modern interpretation of how socialist leaders and communist leaders within South America are to this day pressured by the United States government out of fear of possible Chinese encroachment or other things, possible nationalizations. But now we're going to move on to Ecuador. President, right? So they just overthrew the previous president because they're like, oh, he might be a
Oh wait, I
communist.
remember now.
Okay, yeah, tell him.
Wait, yeah. So they just overthrew the previous president, and then they put in a vice president, and then they find out that the vice president that they install, um, like was just a little too chummy with the communists. So then they throw away this vice president again just to put in a new person. So like it's like even within the people that they themselves are putting in power, aren't like aligning with their own goals, which just shows like how little they are connected to like people and how much more important it is to them to just have no connections or
Yeah,
like to at least
they don't
like
care
push
who they
down
put into
communism.
power. They don't care how evil
Yeah.
they are. They're just like, if you hate communism, you're my friend. And it took them two times because it wasn't just the military. The CIA overthrew both of the presidents in succession, working with the military. And then after you had a military junta, which is like just a military administration that ran the country, and they banned the Communist Party, and the United States was chill with that. They're like, okay, this is good enough. But really, since then, Ecuador has stayed a U.S. ally, especially the last few
Wait,
presidents.
except for one thing.
Okay.
Julian Assange. Ecuador was the country that gave Julian Assange political asylum, and or
Edward
yeah.
Snowden was also associated with that. Uh, you guys know who he
Right, and
is?
and because of that strained the U.S.'s
Yeah.
relations with Ecuador, because I mean, well, Julian Assange was with he was the one that ran WikiLeaks, which leaked
Hmm.
wait, who was the officer, not the officer, or like the military like person that leaked
Well,
like
Snowden leaked NSA secrets. Uh,
well, I know I'm talking about like yeah, but in with Julian Assange it was like the documents on the Vietnam War, they were leaked by
oh,
it. Well, regardless, they were like through WikiLeaks, the documents on the Vietnam War were leaked by
mm,
one of the military personnel,
Yeah. Well, I was
which
gonna
like just
say
completely
just
exposed the
just like the
U.S.
last two presidents, you've seen like a massive increase in like U.S. support because the Ecuadorian like political elite is getting very fearful of like the cartels and gangs in their country. So they've started to try and like bring the United States back to help them. And like literally last year, they had U.S. troops come in, like a few hundred U.S. troops
Mhm.
to help in a Ecuadorian operation, and they try to bring to their Congress, they try to bring a law that would allow foreign what is it, foreign military bases, because they got rid of it in 2009. I think they
mhm.
basically kicked out all foreign bases because like we don't want this anymore, we don't want influence. But now they're trying to actively bring it back in, which is why, for example, when we were doing things against Maduro, Ecuador was like one of the first countries to say this was good because they're trying to get more U.S. support. But now we're gonna move on to Guyana. And Suvidh, do you want to take it over?
Oh wait, actually, I
Sure.
can I can start with Guyana.
Okay,
Okay,
sounds
go
good.
ahead.
I know, yeah. So history on Guyana. So like, Guyana, it started off kind of with in like bad tension with like the U.S. because the U.S. kind of like sanctioned it. Um, a lot because it was favorable to like socialist countries, right? And then so because of that, like there was this disputed territory between Guyana and Venezuela, and because of all like the sanctions, it ended up going to Venezuela, right, Graham?
Well, no, what happened was that when
They.
Guyana became independent, their first
Mhm,
leader started going towards like socialist countries, and he tried to make
mhm.
Guyana socialist. And what happened was the United States basically didn't allow them to be a part of the World Bank. They stopped like
Right.
economic
Okay.
stuff. But what I wrote about earlier was that Venezuela actually claims like half of Guyana, and that was a big deal in like 2 years ago because when Guyana found a lot of oil, uh, the Venezuelans tried to interrupt it by using their old claims. But what's important there is that the United States basically when that was going on, they were like, "Oh, we back Venezuela."
Hmm.
And we backed Venezuela's claim because they didn't like the socialists in Guyana, because this was before Venezuela became socialist,
Right.
but they didn't have Venezuela take it over. But what we're seeing right now in Guyana is the absolute reverse. We're seeing where,
Hmm.
well, before Maduro's government got overthrown, but basically, Guyana found a bunch of oil north of them, and it's like really good oil, not the crappy oil in Venezuela. So U.S. companies came in and sniped it all, and a little Chinese company sniped a little bit. But then Venezuela, they were worried about their neighbor selling a bunch of cheap oil just like they were. So they start like threatening Guyana with a bunch of attacking them and trying to take over that region. But uh Guyana's
I actually want to.
oh yeah, you go
Sorry,
into it.
I was gonna add on. I actually believe that. Well, I mean, the U.S. involvement in Guyana, it goes way before independence. Actually,
Mhm.
um, it starts with this man named Chedi Jagan, who's
Hmm.
actually of Indian descent, which is going to be important later. There's a huge Indian population, Indian as in from the subcontinent of India, not Native American, in Guyana. And again, this is going to be important later on. But he was basically a democratically elected so-called Marxist. He didn't even honestly he didn't even claim himself as a Marxist. They were primarily concerned with his wife, whose name was Janet, I believe, and she was identified with the Communist Party, previously. But they were concerned that he was a socialist, and it was actually Winston Churchill because at this time it was under British occupation. It was a territory of Britain. So Winston Churchill was like, this guy, he's probably a Marxist. Um, Obviously, the Kennedy administration did not like that. So they they asked Britain to delay Guyana's independence, and they are the ones who actually put the president you're talking about, Graham, who
Mhm.
started pushing for socialism. They put in his name was Forbes Burnham. They put him into power because they were like, this guy's better than the
Mhm.
other guy, Jagan. And this is important because the way that we interfered is not traditional, planting documents and assassinating people, but we sparked racial riots and labor strikes. And this is where the ethnicity of this man, Jagan, becomes important. Like I said, he was of Indian descent. He's what you call an Indo-Guyanese, I believe. And there are primarily two groups. There's Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. So
Mhm.
the Afro-Guyanese are obviously they're from, they're like African Americans, but African Guyanese, right?
Mhm.
Um, they identified with Forbes Burnham, the one that we put in power, while the
Mhm.
Indo Guyanese identified with Chedi Jagan. And so this split the whole country down the middle racially. And so there
Mhm.
were tons of racial riots and tons of labor strikes. And basically, that's how we put Forbes Burnham in power. But an important thing to note is that later, back in the 90s, Chedi Jagan actually came back and he came back into power. And he, instead of ruling like a Marxist, as that Britain feared and America feared, he was actually more of a democratic socialist. He pushed for free market policies, he wanted foreign investment, things
Mhm.
like that. He became very good to the US. He actually had very cordial relations with the Clinton administration, which is, contrary to his relationship with the Kennedy administration. So I just think that was important to note because during that time period, they were actually pretty good for us.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really true. And really especially since the oil has been found, like uh after the socialist leader was overthrown, the government has become more liberalized, and they've been trying to get more
Hmm.
US investment in the country, since the country's like pretty small and has like a million people. So they're trying to get a lot more investment from foreign nations. But ever since really the oil discovery, they've become a big ally of the United States and have added to this new doctrine that we're doing. But now we're
Hmm.
gonna go to our final one, which is Peru. Anyone want to take over? Or I can.
I can start.
All right, please.
Uh, all right, cool. Yeah, I mean, okay, so Peru, the main thing I can think of is um, the terrorist organization known as the Shining Path.
Mm-hmm.
So the Shining Path is it's a I guess Maoist, I would say, right? I think. Yeah, they believe in Mao's ideologies, and so the U.S. obviously
Mhm.
doesn't like that. Again, of course, to secure American interests, we sent a bunch of money and a bunch of aid to Peru to fight these insurgents. But another thing I want to note is currently, or actually, I think since 2012, Peru has actually become the number one producer of cocaine above Colombia.
Mhm.
This is important because, like I said, in Colombia, we President Clinton linked counter narcotics to counterinsurgency, and that was a very pivotal moment because we can see the same thing happening in Peru. And
Mhm.
so, specifically, the Shining Path, which was founded by a philosophy professor named Abimael Guzman, um, he sought to overthrow the Peruvian government, establish a communist regime. And he basically, well, well, to go back, really, um, this also has to do with Alberto Fujimori. If you guys know who that is, he was the president of
Wasn't that the
Peru at the
Japanese
time.
guy?
Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. He was Japanese, and he was very brutal. But he was great for America. He was a horrible guy. Like they had tons of human rights abuses. In fact, his head of intelligence, Vladimiro Montesinos, I believe. I mean, yeah,
Mhm.
he just sounds like a bad guy, but uh, like
Vladimir.
So you
yeah,
got the Russian and the Japanese guy running Peru.
yeah, it's interesting, but he was really, really like tons of human rights abuses. He was linked to corruption in the past. In fact, I want to highlight this specifically. During this time, the U.S. aid actually funded a operation under Fujimori, a family planning operation, basically to help um, you know Peru figure out families. And like I said, they're Maoist, so they really subscribe to that neo-Malthusian view of lower birth rates.
Mhm.
We don't want too many people type thing. But basically, we essentially, not us, but Fujimori, go ahead. He went ahead and forcibly got a bunch of women sterilized, like without their informed consent. He just,
Mhm.
soldiers went in, or actually, I don't think it was that intense, but it was without their informed consent. They were basically coerced in return for food or water, and it was very important because this took a racial element to it. It came as a product of like eugenics theory. They
Yeah.
specifically focused on indigenous women, which is
Mhm.
very interesting. Um,
Dude, like Peru, if you like read
Very.
into Peru's history, the entirety of Peru's history is just like an apartheid state. Like,
yeah.
Mexico has almost never had like a good opinion. Like Mexico is mestizo, which means like it's majority like mixed between white and Indian. But it's like Peru
Mhm.
has always had a straight like divide between like the Spanish whites and the Indians, and it like you said to this day, like most of the communist movement is actually natives because it's just people who
Yeah.
who hate the apartheid Lima government, and it's like to this
Mhm.
day it's terrible. But the U.S. still has Peru, like even after, wasn't he assassinated, the Japanese guy?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think he was, but like even after all that, to this day, Peru is still considered one of our biggest allies, even though they produce so much like cocaine there. And actually, the Trump administration is considering giving them the title of a what is it called? Major non-NATO ally.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah,
they're
yeah.
so Peru. It has joined the party with Argentina as like these
Mhm.
massive promoters of Americanism in South America.
And another thing I want to mention just real quick, I mentioned the Shining Path earlier,
Mm,
and how the U.S. sent a bunch of military aid and stuff to Peru. they basically crushed that. But even today, there are certain remnants of the Shining Path, and they've rebranded themselves as the Militarized Communist Party of Peru, and they remain active in the VRAEM region of Peru, which is like Valley de los Rios Apurimac or something. It's a rural area, like you said. It's primarily indigenous people,
Yeah, it's in
and
the hills where like the indigenous people
yeah,
survived. Yeah.
yeah, and they are heavily invested in the illicit drug trade. They literally defend the drug cartels. Every now and then, I mean, you don't see it much, but still today, every now and then they'll attack Peruvian security forces, and they've been designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S., Peru, the EU, and Canada. You know,
It's how they
but
make
yeah,
their money.
pretty crazy.
Yeah. But thank you guys so much for watching. There's actually going to be a part 2 to this since we've only done half of South America. But thank you all for watching and have a great day. Bye.
Bye.